Well, hello everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and I'm going to just get my presentation up. Actually, maybe would you be willing to help with that? Thank you. So my endorphins are really rushing for a couple of reasons. One is that it is such a pleasure and a bit nerve-wracking to be in the room with people who I consider my extraordinary mentors in the climate adaptation field, and I'm really pleased to see a room full of big inquisitors and also big actors in this very important place. I'm also very thrilled to be in a place like Ann Arbor with hills and actual elevation. I'm from Boulder, Colorado, and I now live in Chicago and work in South Bend. And I'm just so sick of flat. So when I really felt like I just wanted to be on a bike swooshing down and cranking up these hills. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you all so much. And I'm eager to go on this journey together, to think a little bit more about how the extraordinary research that comes out of academies like Michigan, Arizona, Notre Dame, and other places is being applied in sectors that really matter. We've heard from the nonprofit sector today, we've heard from local government, and I'm also hopefully going to share a little bit from the private sector as I talk about my experience with adaptation implementation that's based on research. So how to put research into practice. And I think that there are several themes in this quest for really enacting research into impact. And those are noted here. You may have other themes that you've noted and perhaps even can call out for my presentation. So I'm hoping that in the question and answer period, you'll be able to share with me what some of those are. I'll start with the Climate Action Plan. And this presentation is actually organized in 3 parts. So we'll start with the local government, move into corporate, and then end with nonprofit. And I actually think that on reflection, that chronology may be, in fact, the chronology of uptake for climate adaptation actors. And even though many of you are in the nonprofit sphere, and I put you at the end, I do want to really shake the trees a little bit about the nonprofit's focus on climate adaptation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as that moves forward. But there is no doubt in my mind that not only local government, but government overall, including the federal government in the United States, have been the early actors on climate adaptation. The National Climate Assessment is, earth-shattering from my perspective in terms of being a real commitment from the national government to helping all of us do our jobs better as climate adaptation experts. Or experts, or soon-to-be experts, or trying to be experts. That's where I'm fitting in that last category. So the Chicago Climate Action Plan was one of the first action plans coming out of a city to include adaptation. And I think it's quite interesting. It was one of 5 of our actions, so the other 4 dealt with mitigation. And one of the major reasons why it was included relates to the question from the architecture professor from University of Michigan who asked a question earlier about why not just make the whole emphasis of climate change to do with urban heat island. Well, in the city of Chicago, we had quite a tragic event in the mid-1990s where hundreds of people died in an extreme heat event. Many people who, like Dr. O'Neill mentioned earlier, were prone, particularly vulnerable because of poverty, age, and illness to extreme heat. And when we were putting together our climate action plan 5 years later, we thought to ourselves, how can we incorporate this question of extreme heat in the plan? So adaptation was definitely on the books to do that. But and the other reason why adaptation was clearly included was because at the time, Mayor Daly, who was leading this plan, was so focused on beautification. And for him, sustainability really meant landscaping and beautiful streets. And he did evolve over time to understand sustainability to mean something much bigger than that. But we needed a place to put all of his green roofs and his bioswales and his trees. And adaptation was really the only place where that fit. So I want to be really honest with you that the adaptation question came about through political reasons. And I think that in the end, it also resulted in a great deal of leadership from the city around things that matter to all of us in the room, besides just the aesthetics of how our streets function. So in any case, we were very grateful to have Dr. Hayhoe and Dr. Wibbles as climate scientists who were willing to do some downscaling of their data and came up with some interesting charts that we turned into things for the public that essentially said things like, without all of us being better mitigators, you're going to see 31 more days of 100 degrees or more. And we had just had one death in the LaSalle Marathon on an 85-degree day. And so this was when this plan came out in 2009, really kind of startling to people about the number of days. Of course, in the newer scenarios, the number of days are much higher. We also talked a little bit about morbidity and mortality, but it's very hard for a city to talk about morbidity and mortality. I mean, for politicians to make mention of those words. So it was rare that we spoke about that. Instead, we talked about how there would be more pressure on the services that you care for. And the gentleman who is a leader in the city efforts here in Ann Arbor spoke to the question of the firefighters and the policemen. That is a really important constituent group to get engaged with the adaptation question and the quest for more adaptation action. So the increased demand on first responders was really where we focused. And we also had maps that, like the Nature Conservancy's map, showed where our climate was going to go to. But really, people don't necessarily see those maps as impacting them. So we really talked a lot about the inconvenience about the rain. And we have combined sewers in Chicago, so there were other slides and so on that we talked about related to combined sewer overflows, and especially swim bans in Lake Michigan. Because for us, the issue is that when we have a lot of extreme rain that floods into our sewers too rapidly, untreated sewage goes into Lake Michigan. Otherwise, it simply goes down the river to those that are downstream. So it's not as if it's pleasant for anyone in any case. But one of the really unique things about what happened in the city of Chicago, and something that I encourage local government leaders to really consider, was that we presented a business case for climate action. We were lucky to have pro bono resources from a company called Oliver Wyman, and they did a really detailed economic risk analysis for the city of Chicago that determined that if we did nothing, in the higher emissions scenario, we would have $3.2 billion in losses in the city by 2050. So this was even within the realm of my lifetime, or certainly that of my son's. And that number was really astounding to our city council. So just to go back to the initial that we were going to do adaptations because it allowed us to do more trees in the parkways, we're now talking about billions of dollars in a city that we now all know is very close to being on the brink of not being solvent due to some very significant financial issues. So this question of economic risk became core to how we adopted more adaptation impact actions. Another area that was very helpful for us was that we were able to speak about adaptation as a collateral benefit of mitigation. And as you'll hear later in my presentation, I don't necessarily think that Venn diagram or the nexus holds up in other environments or other geographies. I think it's a much stronger argument in the first world, where you can talk to these collateral benefits of doing street trees or anything to do basically with stormwater management that has the mitigative benefit, for instance, along with the adaptive benefit. And of course, anything to do with public health as it relates to extreme heat generally has both of those benefits. But I also want to point out that we might lose some of our audience if we focus too much on the mitigation versus adaptation nexus. So there may be other nexus that you have in mind for the constituency that you care about, whether they are interested in health or in water or in money or whatever it is. You know, be sure that this nexus, which is used very frequently in conversations about adaptation, doesn't get in the way of them thinking about what really matters to them and being able to listen to you in particular. So one of the neat things about Chicago, too, was that we were doing the climate adaptation project at a time of a lot of resources. One of the reasons we had resources, interestingly, was that our electric utility had failed during that extreme heat event that I mentioned to you. The city had sued them, and as part of the settlement, they had given the city money for sustainability. So that's where we got some of the money for our climate action plan. It actually came out of a precursor climate event. But we were able to create these documents, which even though they're now 5 or 6 years old, I still refer to, and I encourage any of you who are interested in the question of local government action to take a quick look at them and peruse what some of the lessons were from our work. To just be really fair, I also want to close on the question of the city action by mentioning that we now have a new mayor, Mayor Emanuel. And of course, he's come in with a whole new set of goals. And he's also come in with a whole new set of challenges that were sort of unveiled around the time of his election. And his Sustainable Chicago 2015 plan doesn't have adaptation in it, anywhere that you can see or say that word. On the other hand, just like January 1st of 2013, when the largest climate adaptation bill ever was passed through the US Congress, the Sandy Reconstruction Act, there's a lot in Mayor Emanuel's Sustainable 2015 plan that does relate to adaptation. It's just not called that. So one thing I learned from this is to really be sure that when we speak to stakeholders, we come to them from where they need to be listened to, and maybe cull the activities that they've already created and call them adaptation leaders, in spite of the fact that they might not call it out themselves. One other lesson from this, again for any city leaders in the audience, is New York did something really quite remarkable. They actually had City Council pass a law that on an annual basis, on Earth Day, the city government needs to come to City Council and tell them how they've progressed on their climate plan. Chicago did nothing like that. We didn't really involve City Council. We involved a lot of other stakeholders, but in not doing so with a new administration, we lost the climate plan, essentially. So just another quest that you might keep in mind is how to make regulation part of your plan, aside from the laws that you pass that relate to stormwater or air quality and other things. What about making the plan itself a law? So thinking then about what the city did, I was very inspired by this question of the corporate engagement in the Chicago Climate Action Plan, and wanted to test a thesis for myself, which was, isn't it true, Joyce, that the corporate sector needs to be the change we need to see in the world in order for me to achieve the kind of climate action goals I'm looking for? And I came to this understanding or question thesis from trying to work with corporations around the various laws that I was promulgating in the city of Chicago, especially around stormwater management and air quality. They had so much power, so much money, and the work that we were doing around regulation was just sort of barely getting into the areas of their work. And so I really wanted to see whether I could actually help corporations to see a return on investment for being positive climate actors, both mitigating and adapting to climate change. So I moved to Edelman, which is in fact the largest PR firm in the world, and I worked with Fortune 500 firms on their corporate social responsibility. And so of course, because I'm at a PR firm and I'm working on responsibility, CSR, I'm really focused a lot on reputation. So, just take that and understanding away as you think about my particular piece of CSR, because engineering firms do corporate responsibility, accounting firms do corporate responsibility, and they're all going to come at it from their own perspective. But in my case, I just want to also mention that there in the corporate sector is a very large gap. And that's what this slide shows. I'm sorry that many of you can't read the words. I should have made them larger. But the purple is what businesses should do, and the green is current performance. This is a survey of 35,000 educated elite around the world that's released at a place called Davos, the World Economic Forum's annual gathering in January every year. And it shows that around the world there's a very, very significant gap. Let's just take a country, for instance, Germany. The gap is, over 60 points between what businesses should do and their current performance. And so Edelman asked the question, well, how can that gap be closed? And they recommend, based upon the survey responses, that it be closed through a variety of different trust-building attributes. So again, it's a little bit based on reputation, right? But when you look at this list, you can see that there are many that relate to the kinds of things we're talking about today: working to protect and improve the environment, addressing society's needs, positively impacting the local community. Those are all things that have been discussed on the main stage here today. So what that question is, from my perspective, how can you actually galvanize those corporates to actually see the kind of return on investment, closing the gap between what's expected of them and what they're actually doing through corporate responsibility? Another, I think, very important set of data, again, this is a different, perhaps, set of science than most of the hard scientists that have spoken today, but on the social science side, looking at surveys of corporate perception, the World Economic Forum does put out a survey of global risk perception. I think it's of 16,000 corporates every year. And this year, fully 4 of the top 10 risks related to climate adaptation. And this is quite astounding. The survey's been going on for a decade, and I've been watching it for the last 3 or 4 years. And last year there were 2 issues, water and food did make it to the top 10. But I think this year's data really suggests that the corporate sector is ready to understand climate adaptation as part of what is going to make them a thriving corporate set in a very considerably shifting globe in the future. And some of those other data, for instance, coming from what used to be known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, is now known as CDP. They do a survey of corporate supply chains, which last year said that 72% of corporate responders saw risks to their supply chain value chains from climate disruption, and this year said 70%. The difference may be that you might recall that in Thailand, in 2013, or 2012, there was an extreme flood event, only in one small part of the country, but it caused, I think, $4 billion in impact in the corporate sphere. For instance, Honda had a $25 million hit just because they couldn't get brakes, brake pads that they normally got through the southern part of Thailand out in time. Other numbers like that, General Motors says that if there is an extreme drought that affects water supply in the northern part of Mexico, they could lose $25 million in a month and a half. So there's real numbers behind these climate risks now. Corporations are calculating them, but they're not necessarily calling them climate adaptation or resiliency or any of the words preparation that we might talk about. They talk about things like business continuity planning, which they've been doing forever. And in fact, I think that some of the comments from the Ann Arbor expert really helped me to remind myself that most actors that deal with corporate or the capital assets or supply chains, operations, they have been resiliency and adaptation experts forever. And so coming at this from the perspective of how they can take their business continuity plan and incorporate the questions of climate may in fact be one way that we can really increase the amount of corporate adoption of engagement in this question around adaptation. So this question of supply chain risk, I think, is further gotten at by others. Green Biz puts out a stated green business report every year, and many firms are seeing environmental costs in their supply chain, some more than others. The food and beverage sector, I think, especially due to some of the numbers that Kathy shared around water, is seeing some of the biggest ones. But there's also, I think, a lot of corporations that are seeing the sustainability question as being a really much bigger part of their business strategy. And this number has grown from 50% in 2008 to 90% last year. This is from MIT's Sloan Management Review, the Innovation Bottom Line. I love this picture, by the way. I don't know if any of you recognize it, but this is Goldman Sachs at Sandy. So Goldman Sachs has a corporate social responsibility leader who talked to Adam Freed, who was mentioned earlier in someone's presentation. And Adam was the the climate adaptation expert for the city of New York for quite a while, now works for the Nature Conservancy as a water expert there globally. And they talked about sort of, was Goldman Sachs ready for the next big event? And it was apparently due to that conversation that the sustainability officer talked to the risk operator at Goldman Sachs, and they upped their power of their generators, and especially they upped the height of their sandbags. And so they were really the only ones on in this part of Manhattan for several days. So anyway, it can be very personal, but you can also see a story like this and perhaps suggest to your financial house, what are they doing lately to figure out their climate adaptation? And have they done something for, to suggest something further for the financial wherewithal of those funds that they operate? One last thing on the corporate side that I'll mention is that the millennials' expectations for corporate sustainability may be one of the most important galvanizers that we have as climate adaptation experts. Because millennials expect so much more from the products that they purchase, but especially from the corporations and other entities that they work for, in terms of those corporations being positive actors in society. And as I pivot to the quest in the nonprofit sector around climate adaptation, I will say that I think one thing that has really happened in my career, and maybe some of you in the climate adaptation world would agree, is there's been a shift in my understanding about the climate question from being an environmental question to being a humanitarian one. And I really feel as though climate change is now the humanitarian crisis of our time. And from the global perspective, we have such an incredible obligation to be adapting right now very swiftly in poorer countries. And I think that a lot of the millennials, when you think about Todd's shoes that will give you one pair here and a pair in an emerging economy, that question about what's happening in other places that I may have visited or heard about is much more present in millennials' minds. So I'm not sure what to do about that, but I think it's something that we all should pay very close attention to, because I believe they may be some of the best soldiers we have as climate adaptation actors. So I'm going to just finish with some ideas that came in the nonprofit sector now, again, thinking about how research can be applied and make action. Based upon a couple of ideas that I've already mentioned earlier in my presentation. One is business continuity planning. So the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index is a country resiliency index. It's essentially the world's leading index showing which countries are best prepared to deal with climate disruption. And we are a listing of 177 countries across 17 years of data using 50 indicators. And I'll talk a little bit more about what some of those indicators are in a moment. But just to give you a flavor, the United States is at 13. In the last 17 years, we've gone from 9 at one time to 16 at another, and now we're at 13. Certainly our recession, by the way, had an impact on the index, which I'll talk about a little bit more when I speak about some of the indicators that we choose. And some of those that are at the very bottom have made some extraordinary progress around their resiliency. So the question about why would we share these data is really answered by reminding ourselves that corporations, which is, by the way, the group that ND Gain is most focused on, the Global Adaptation Index is trying to raise the awareness in the corporate sphere around the need for adaptation in order to increase the uptake in adaptation investments that save lives and improve livelihoods while shoring up market positions. So this is my whole question. Is there, in fact, a positive return on investment for corporations being involved as climate actors? I think in the mitigation sphere, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, we've seen that in some cases, as it relates to, for instance, energy efficiency marketplace, renewables marketplace, and even the Clean Air Act and all the extraordinary business that's come out of that over the course of the last several decades, there definitely is. And I believe very strongly that there's also a very important return on investment for adaptation, and that's going to be one of the major ways that we increase the amount of adaptation action that's happening around the world. So one very key difference from the Global Adaptation Index from other indices that you may have looked at, or perhaps other benchmarks or assessments that relate to climate, is that we include not only the vulnerability indicators, which I'll talk about in a moment, but we also include what we call readiness. The readiness to accept adaptation investment. That is economic, governance, and social indicators. And the reason why we include these indicators is because we want to address those questions that keep corporations up at night. And right now, certainly they're kept up at night when there's a flood in Thailand that shuts down their supply chain for brake pads in Honda around the world. But they're also really kept up at night by the lack of a well-educated workforce or political instability in a country where they are thinking about doing a merger and acquisition. And it really has a huge impact on where they think they may do their next investment. So we do include those resiliency indicators that relate to readiness, along with another set of about 40 indicators that relate to vulnerability. And these indicators we've heard so much about in previous presentations today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides, but I'm happy to answer questions about any of them if you wish. And one of the most important things that the Global Adaptation Index is doing now that it's housed at Notre Dame, where it came about a year ago, it sits within the Environmental Change Initiative of the university, is that we are working with the university and the overall academic community around the world to ensure that the indicators that we're using are in fact reflective of what climate adaptation and resiliency mean. So I'm eager for feedback from you as experts as well on those selections of indicators. We'll have a new index out in November of this year. The index is in fact annual, and right now it's at the country scale. As I mentioned, 177 countries, but there's a lot of opportunity to use the methodology that we have, for instance, for port cities around the world, or for specific watersheds, let's say in peri-urban areas, and so on. So the question that I bring to the index is, what does this mean from the perspective of a corporation that has holdings around the world? And how do they, as positive actors in the world, make a difference for increasing resiliency? One number that I really find quite startling when looking at the data and analyzing what from the Global Adaptation Index is that it will take poorer countries, lower income countries, over 100 years to reach the level of resiliency of OECD or upper income countries. So we are an OECD country, for instance. Over 100 years. So we had Hurricane Sandy, and we heard about some of that earlier today. It's still reflecting very much on the US conscience, and there are many community members who are still impacted every day by Hurricane Sandy. And the same goes for Katrina and that amazing diaspora that was shown in Dr. O'Neill's slide earlier today. Well, 100 years, put us back 100 years and think about how the Philippines is managing, rebounding from Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda. From last year, for instance, November of last year. And think about the fact that we are just about to enter the cyclone season again. So what countries are most at risk to those coastal storms, and how many people can we expect to lose again? And of course, the built infrastructure too. So I really find these numbers quite astounding and a real call to action. But there's also, I think, some hope in these numbers. So when I talk about resiliency, each one of the vulnerability indicators has an adaptive capacity measure that's a part of it, and we clump those together into resiliency, in this case for this chart, for instance. And one thing I want you to pull from this chart is, the United States and Japan and Australia, South Korea, were fairly stable across the last 17 years as it relates to our adaptive capacity or resiliency. But there are some countries that are at the very bottom of the heap when it comes to their resiliency to climate impact, but they're gaining so rapidly. So for instance, in the case of Cambodia and Laos, this is a slide that I put together for a presentation in the Southeast Asian nations at the World Economic Forum several weeks ago. Cambodia and Laos are gaining because they're doing so much to improve their health force. So many more healthcare professionals per capita should in fact increase the amount of people that survive their next extreme event. And that might not have been the first thing you thought of when you thought about climate resiliency in Laos, because they're quite, they have hydropower concerns that drought will really impact, so energy security is a big deal. They have very few paved roads, so they have a real question when flood seasons come around how you get goods around. And they certainly have risks from overbank flooding of rivers, and what it means for their agriculture that's so reliant on fresh water resources. But the key is that they also are beginning to make progress on some of those measures that can be highly adaptive for them, including in this case their health resources. So as I close, I just want to speak a little bit to how this research and these data are used in the corporate sphere and in other institutional spheres. For instance, Standard & Poor's uses ND gain to help determine where certain countries' bond ratings are going to now really be impacted by climate change. They've recently done their own index. They used ND gain for it. And by the way, I don't necessarily think that using an index for an index is a great idea, because many of you would probably agree with me that indices are filled with warts, and ND gain is no different than others. You don't want to magnify a potential problem within an index by then adding it into another index, and you lose the question of what was that one particular detail that really matters for the decision that we want to make. And so that's why an index is such an important tool for helping to raise awareness that then needs to be addressed by further research and investigation, some of which can come from a country profile within an index, but others of which needs to come from the academic community and other experts in the field. So in any case, Standard & Poor's used GAIN to help determine that Vietnam, in fact, is at great risk, the greatest of the 115 countries that they profiled, for losing or coming down on its credit rating, bond rating, due to climate change. The World Economic Forum and Swiss Re, I know a question was asked earlier today about the insurance industry. Well, they're using ND gain to figure out how they might scale out some innovative insurance mechanisms that they're starting in the Philippines to other countries that have similar risk profiles as it relates to extreme events. True Value, your Main Street hardware store, you wouldn't necessarily think of them needing a global index, but of course the vast majority of products sold on True Value's shelves are from other countries. So when they do their business continuity plan, they ask all sorts of questions that relate to international stability. Everything from the Corruption Perceptions Index that Transparency International puts out to now GAIN. What will climate change mean for how easy it is for True Value to get the goods on the store's shelves that you need? Other firms use the index for mergers and acquisitions to determine, whether ArcelorMittal's case, the steel manufacturer in the Great Lakes, when they think about whether they should do a merger and acquisition in Mali or Liberia, one tool they use is GAIN, because it can help them to determine that even though the profile for Mali and Liberia both are extremely risky countries. I mean, many of us wouldn't necessarily think to invest there, but when you're in extractives industry, you go to those places, but you also need to be shoring up the hospitals, the roads, the schools, in order to provide for your workplace. And so GAIN can help you determine where you should be building the most, where they have the biggest needs for adaptive capacity as you begin to make those investments. So I want to mention as we close that there are ways that you all could be involved in this global question. We have a Global Adaptation Prize that the applications are currently open. It's a very simple application, and it's no money, but recognition from an international community of climate adapters, and you might want to take a look at that. And I also want to mention that we are, in fact, going to begin to work in other scales. So it's been very exciting over the course of the last year that Notre Dame has had the index, and the last 3 years that the Global Adaptation Index has existed, to try out this question about how to make an index that reflects adaptation from the perspective of risk and opportunity around the globe. At the country scale, it's been slightly easier. We use primarily World Bank and United Nations data. We also have some data from the Heritage Foundation in our index, which we'll be moving on from in November. But we also have the intention to make the index much more local. And I think that most of the presentations that we heard today have a lot of incredible local story. And one of the reasons why I've been so incredibly moved in my career around adaptation is that it is so local. Adaptation is about, my family. If I owned a company, it would be about the clients or the consumers that purchase my products. It would be about my employees and how they got to work, and it would be about the buildings that I own or that I lease or that I work in. So climate adaptation, unlike the very ethereal question of climate mitigation, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, has the benefit of being incredibly local. And that means that I think we can engage more and more people on this adaptation question if we come at it from the perspective of their local concerns. And I think that National Climate Assessment was the biggest gift for all of us in doing that, because it gave us the opportunity to show locally, the Midwest, or for the food sector, what it really could mean for them to be positively involved in the climate adaptation question. So in any case, if any of you have interest in making some next steps with us as it relates to urban assessments or sector assessments, food or the extractives industry, for instance, or regional assessments, we'd be very keen to work with any of you on that. So I look forward to questions. Thank you so much.
So you have to think across sectors when you're thinking about climate change. And it's reached the information age. It's digital, it's interactive.